Well, hello everyone and welcome to CatalystWest Conversations. I'm your host today for today's episode, Helen Barcham. In today's episode, we're going to talk about and discuss a dimension of the COVID-19 saga that has received relatively little attention and airtime. That is how social and cultural life is being reconfigured through this moment of social isolation. Now, before we get any further, I'd like to remind you all that today's series is not a lecture, it's a conversation, and that means that we rely on your participation. So for all of you playing at home, you can be part of the conversation today and steer it in any way you like by using the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. Send us your comments, send us your questions, and over the course of the next 60 minutes, we'll endeavour to answer them. On your screen right now, you'll see a poll and we're asking you a number of questions just to understand who you are and what your thinking is. So please make some time to fill that in. I can see that some of our guests have already done that, which is great. So my guest today, and I'm very excited to host her, is an award-winning journalist and TV presenter. She was, of course, the host and the MC of the CatalystWest Forum held in November last year. Her funny and razor-sharp political show, The Fran, has been viewed by more than 20 million people around the world. She's on our screens. She's got more than 100,000 followers on social media, so she's on our feeds as well. And come next year, her comedic memoir on Middle Eastern appearance will be in our bookstores as well. So, Fran, welcome. Good to have you back.
Hey, thanks so much for having me back, and hello to everyone who can see me. Just for the record, I cannot see any of you. So if you're not wearing pants right now, that's okay. I cannot see and I cannot judge. So don't feel bad if you need to get up at any point or look around. We cannot see you and we cannot hear you. But it's really, really nice to be here. This is actually the first Zoom chat sort of webinar that I've done since I guess the lockdown. So it's really interesting to kind of see how this plays out and how the connection kind of happens around this. Because from where I'm sitting, this very esteemed bookshelf over here, which is just a prop, by the way, haven't read any of the books, but I'm sort of just staring down at the little green light on the top of my Mac. So it's just, it's nice to know that you're all out there.
Jen, a pressing question is, how the hell have you managed to escape so many Zoom webinars? Because most are the new norm for us.
I know, it's a real strategy that I've managed to perfect quite well. Look, luckily, you know that old saying, the meeting that could have been an email. We all know that meeting that could have been an email. Yeah. Unfortunately, that meeting is not an email. It's now turned into a Zoom meeting. So what I'm starting to find is that people are no longer calling me on the phone. They're having Zoom meetings. And I'm like, guys, this could be a phone call. We don't have to set up a Zoom, you know.
Interesting. Sorry, do you think that's a way of people trying to reach out and stay connected during these times?
Yeah, I think people are just trying to work out. We're sort of just feeling our way around, aren't we? Because, I mean, this has never happened before. We don't really know what works, what doesn't. We don't know what the sort of longer term effects of Zooming are on kind of like the brain, the body, how it rewires us. So we're sort of just trying to figure this out as we go and trying, I think, as much as possible to just maintain some level of normalcy. You know, yeah. So texting's not enough. I think people are calling people a little bit more. And I think people just sort of want to connect with other people. They want to be able to see people face to face, hence the many, many Zooms taking place.
So, Jan, before we delve into an analysis or assessment of that kind of on a broader scale, I want to ask, what are you doing on a personal level to stay connected to colleagues, to family and friends? And obviously the fact that you work in the creative industries, that's a sector that's been, you know, largely impacted by what's happening right now. What are the implications for your work, for your colleagues? How's that all unfolding for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll address those two questions sort of separately. In terms of what I'm doing, I don't think I've had more WhatsApp video calls with my immediate family than what I have in the last 2 months. Some would say it's a lot. Some would say it's not enough. What I would say is I feel in this really strange way, I actually feel a little bit more connected to my family. Like I'm joking around with my mum a lot more. When we're not at her house, my background's Lebanese, so you can imagine there's a lot of commotion when barbecues happen. Mum's running around everywhere. You don't really get to talk to people. In a weird way, she's got more time because she's a public school teacher and she's not teaching. I found myself with a little bit more time because I've had a couple of jobs that have been cancelled or postponed. And so we've just had this time to just talk to my mum, which I sort of wouldn't really have done if we were going over for a barbecue or there was an occasion that we were, it's sort of created this kind of this time that somehow we wouldn't really have made time for if it wasn't kind of foisted upon us. So there seems to be a positive kind of outcome from that, just personally in terms of my relations with my family.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think what you've done there, Jan, is actually address a trend that we're seeing play out kind of more broadly, which some are calling, the emergence of slow movements. And so really what that is masses of people taking up activities that we usually don't have time for, like baking.
Yeah.
And yoga at home and walking, of course. So aside from these things being fun and relaxing, do you think that there's also a kind of political potential in these activities? And I might be reading too much into this, but in the sense that, do they present an antidote to a world that we've been accustomed to that is, accelerated, it's fast, it's, marked by lots of burnout and other things?
Yeah. The short answer to that is, I hope so. I think that what we've kind of realized, or what we're slowly starting to contemplate, is what our life was sort of like before, what's now been taken away, how much what has been taken away actually meant to us or was benefiting us, and what sort of new benefits and or losses are we feeling in this particular time, So I think it's kind of asking us questions around, well, what sort of a society were we, and actually what sort of a society can we be? I think that's a really interesting question. And, the one thing that has really, really stood out for me in this whole thing is the people that are the most valuable to us are drivers, they are cleaners, they are nurses, they are doctors, they are teachers, they are supermarket workers. These are the people that we have come to value in this time. And yet, for a lot of them, they're our lowest paid. They're people that we don't really ascribe, a super high, a kind of professional status to sometimes. And just having them be there at the front line is really kind of making me think long and hard about the value in those sorts of jobs and those sorts of professions. And again, that feeds into a much bigger question of, what kind of society were we, what kind of society are we, and what kind of society do we want to be once we kind of come out of this and have to start rebuilding certain elements?
Yeah. Before we kind of get to that, I want to talk about some of the things that the changes that we're experiencing at the moment. So while sites such as, pubs, clubs and sporting events, which of course are very much part of the Australian way of life, have been, not accessible to many people, other pockets of social life or mediated social life have really, we've seen a rise in those spaces. So for example, we've seen the cringeworthy TikTok videos go viral, which are bringing, people and communities together. We've seen reports of dating app use on the rise. Facebook is reporting about a 40% increase in engagement there. What do you think this mass exodus to the digital spaces is telling us? Is that telling us that we want to stay connected, or that we're just purely bored, or perhaps a bit of both?
No, I think it's telling us that we definitely want to stay connected to people. We want to be able to build relationships with people outside of the ones that we're legally allowed to be in the presence of, you know. Now, those relationships that we build online, I would argue, are not the same as the relationships that you would have in real life. In some ways, they're better. In some ways, they're not. In many ways, they're just different. That's not a judgment call. That's more of an observation. So I think it's human beings needing to connect to people in some way. It's human beings, I think, needing to have a bit of solidarity around this time. You know, I think it's people who just, often when we have a problem or when we're feeling really low or when we're feeling a particular way, sometimes it just really helps to hear that other people feel like this too sometimes. And you're not alone in the way that you're feeling. And so I think in this time where we're all confused and we're all a bit apprehensive, I know I certainly am, just because we're not sure what's going to happen, how we're going to come out of this. I think people just want to know that there are other people in that same boat. And I think that has really given people a certain degree of comfort. So I think partly that's what it's about, that kind of exodus to those online spaces, because they've just become the only spaces. And it just sort of goes to show how creative human beings are, how innovative human beings are, how flexible human beings are, and possibly, let's not lie, maybe how bored human beings are, you know. But this necessity, I mean, necessity is the mother of all innovation, isn't it? This kind of need to connect sort of allows you to try that in new and different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because the changes that we're seeing are not just, of course, in the spike of people using these technologies or, you know, migrating to these spaces, but also changes in the way that people are engaging in these spaces. So, for example, there was a report this morning on Radio National about the use of dating apps, and some academics talking about people spending more time actually sending longer replies and perhaps ghosting not being something that people are doing so much at the moment. I mean, you've got, you know, you boast a social media following of over 100,000 people. Have you seen any of, you know, of those changes emerge through your kind of social media communities? Are people speaking to you or reaching out in different ways?
I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, I'm married, so I'm not necessarily on the dating apps, but I do know a couple of people who've had some like online Zoom dates, which they've given me kind of mixed feedback about. You know, one of the good things is that they can call it a day anytime. You know, they don't have to finish a drink, they're done. It's like, okay, thanks so much. The other side of the coin is that obviously you miss that kind of face-to-face interaction. What I've noticed, the big thing that I've noticed is this kind of like hunger for information that people have, a hunger for a way to try and understand what's going on. I think every time I sort of post something about the, you know, just my thoughts on the crisis, either it's a video or it can be just on my own social media channels, I find there's a lot of engagement with that. And I think that that's partly because we're trying to work out, you know, what's going on exactly. We're trying to find ways of understanding what's going on. And I think people are doing that in really different ways. Like we've seen all of the kind of the TikTok videos, and full disclosure, I'm maybe too old to use TikTok. I think it's illegal for anyone over the age of 30 to use TikTok. That's true. So I've been looking at TikTok in a very older millennial kind of way, which is just watching the videos that end up on Twitter. Yeah. That's a very old millennial way of looking at TikTok. But again, it's all sort of just part of like forming some kind of connection while we're all, you know, in our homes and in our rooms, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, you know, speaking of TikTok, I think I just make that kind of legal cut, Fran. So I am on there, a little snoop, not making any videos, I promise. But I read a recent report which was interesting, is that the content that is on TikTok is primarily, or the ones that are going viral anyway, are primarily content focused on actual coronavirus information and helping to spread that. And of course, we've seen the WHO, you know, partner with TikTok to help younger people get access to that information. And that's superseded content around, you know, that social influencers usually put on there. So again, it's speaks to that kind of reconfiguration of that space. So I guess it makes me think about, you know, what is the role of other institutions like the WHO in connecting with young people to ensure that they are adequately across what's happening in the world? And should we expect that they do more of that?
I'd love to see any leaders of any country and any leaders of any kind of, I mean, the WHO is huge. So yes, there definitely should be a kind of a top-down information export, if you will. I'm sure there was a better way to say that, but let's just go with that. I also think it's incumbent upon not just massive organizations like that, but also governments in particular countries, so our federal government, our state government, institutions within, you know, state government or even private institutions, to be as transparent and as open as possible about this. And I think when, you know, saying that the stuff that's gone viral on TikTok has been stuff around corona related information, I'm not surprised by that at all, because there really is this hunger or there really is this interest in wanting to know a little bit more about the world, because it is such a unique and in many ways it's such a stressful time. And I think it was really clever of the WHO to try and utilize the mediums where you're able to reach a particular audience. In TikTok's case, it's quite young, it's teenagers, but also utilizing the other kind of social media outlets as well. I think information accessible to everyone is really important. The thing is, you need to tailor the message for the medium, and there are like 10,000 mediums. So, you know, I don't envy the communication strategist in the PM's office at the moment.
We've just had a question come through from Samantha, which is quite interesting, and she raises a point that was that emerged in last week's episode as well, is around the kind of longevity of the changes that we're experiencing right now. So Samantha asks, do you think that social isolation will have a long-term effect on our personal behaviour? How will we interact physically with others in real space or in real life? We'll give Jen a moment to take a sip and to mull that over. While she, I encourage you all to post your questions. We want to hear from you and steer the conversation in weird and wacky ways. So send your questions through, please. Back over.
Yeah, we can definitely see there's questions coming in. So how do I think social isolation, whether it will have a long-term effect on our personal behavior? You know, that's a really hard question to try and answer. I think it's been such a massive change for everyone. And I think it's been a very fast change for everyone. And I think the effects of that and the consequences of that, I don't think are going to be fully seen or fully realized for a while. I think what this period of time has done for a lot of people, again, is it's just brought into the center what is most important, what was actually not that important that you thought was important before, the reliance on services and what kind of services you think are really important, and the reliance on sort of people in your life that you think are really important. I think given how much we are thinking about this, it would seem strange, or it would seem unlikely for it to not affect us in some way. But how it affects us and the degree to which it affects us and how long actually that effect lasts, I just think is a really hard question to try and answer. I think we're going to value people a bit more. I hope that we value people a bit more. But, you know, humans have very, very short-term memories, don't they? They really do. I mean, I don't know what happened last week. I can't remember. You know, maybe once we hit 2021, people just think, oh yeah, 2020, I forgot about that horrendous year. You know, maybe we block it out entirely. Who knows?
Yeah, interesting. And I think it's something, you know, we're all grappling with at the moment is, you know, what is business as usual, and whether, you know, that will ever stick again.
One thing that I sort of did was, I live in an apartment block. I've never met my neighbours. I mean, you see them in the hallways. I think there's like 11 units in this block. I see my neighbours in the hallway. I say hello to my neighbours in the hallway, and that's kind of it. I don't know who lives nearby. I don't know who lives upstairs. I don't know anything about them. And I was thinking to myself the other day, you know, if something happened if I needed to get something, if I needed a hand with something and I couldn't leave, if the situation was a little bit worse than, you know, what thankfully it's been, I have no one in my vicinity to rely on. You know, my parents live in Bankstown. My sister lives in Canterbury. You can't just hop in a car and drive. And so the idea of the community starting in your street, I think, is something that has really been driven home to me. And so the other day, I bought 10 chocolate bars, and I just put a little note that said, "Hi, just a quick note, just to say hope that you're doing okay in this, you know, really weird time." And I just left it out the doors of the apartment buildings. And within maybe 2 hours, I opened my apartment door to go downstairs. I think it was just to get the mail. And there was like a bottle of wine from a neighbor who I would prior have not had any kind of contact with. But suddenly, because everything's been sort of just, you know, the focus has been zoomed in on this time and on the home and on the physicality of where we are, our location, suddenly then your neighbors and the people around you become really important. And so it took this pandemic for me to reach out to my neighbors and to get to know them.
Yeah, that's we're hearing lots of stories of similar stories emerge like that too.
Yeah, I think Katie had just a point that Katie James made in the questions as well, where, you know, she said that the SMH reported stories of siblings who lived together but maybe didn't spend too much time together. It's funny how this pandemic is shifting how much you spend with people and who those people are. It's a similar thing to the story about the neighbors, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Jan, I want to come back to, I want to address that. Anyone that's on Twitter would have seen it because it did kind of go viral, a thread that you made on there, and you said something to the effect of what this pandemic has really highlighted is the disparities and the disadvantage that exist at the moment. Can you talk us a little through that? And I imagine some of that is what you alluded to at the start around, you know, certain people in certain professions, but keen to hear more from you on that.
Yeah, well, look, I think, you know, there's a lot of kind of rhetoric around this idea of if we shut everything down for an indefinite period of time, we might save some lives now from the illness, but we might lose some lives later from, you know, the consequences of economic collapse, which are very, very real. I find sometimes that the people making the arguments to, you know, reopen the country and to do it quickly and to get the economy up and running and to get productivity up and running, I find that they're usually not the people that will actually suffer the most if we decided to go down that route. You know, they're not the sick, they're not the old, they're not the disabled, they're not the people who are in dire financial situation, maybe living in a house with 5 or 7 other people and they can't socially isolate. So I think sometimes arguing for a particular point, when you don't necessarily have to be the one dealing with the repercussions, I think it's very important to keep in mind, actually, the people who will have to bear the brunt of that particular type of policy. And that also extends to frontline workers as well. You know, if I argued for the economy to be opened back up, that's great. I'd love for the economy to be opened back up tomorrow. I don't want to be in this apartment anymore. You know, I would love for things to be able to restart as soon as possible. But, you know, I'm not the one on the front line. I'm not a supermarket worker. I'm not a driver. I'm not a teacher. I'm safe in my own home. So if we end up with a situation where, you know, the virus is, and look, I think, you know, knock on wood, slight superstition there. It seems like we've passed the worst of it. If we have some kind of a second wave because we decide to do, you know, to follow a particular policy, I'm not the one that's going to suffer from that. I'm not the one that's going to bear the brunt of that. And so I think it's a really serious moral question around, well, whose life do we deem valuable and whose life do we deem dispensable, and why? And we've got this kind of society that's built around productivity. The more productive you are, the more valuable you are. My grandmother is 85. She's not very productive. She's one of the vulnerable people. If we reopen the economy tomorrow and hey, who knows what happens? Well, she's 85. She's lived a good life. She can't contribute to this society as much as what I can, say, for example. And look, if you want to measure the human being in terms of their productivity, then that is true. Yeah, my grandma can't contribute as much economically as what I can. But is that a measure of a human being? Is that the entire measure of a human being? Is that how I measure my grandmother? Is that okay? So again, a lot of sort of moral questions, I think, being opened up. And for me, it's more about the people who are vulnerable that I think we've really kind of got to think about, because they're the ones that are going to wear the consequences of any kind of decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point that you make about, productivity fast becoming, a marker of self and social worth. And there is a weird disjuncture that is actually playing out. As you said, some of the people that we've had to rely on so much at the moment, in a micro sense, that could be, our Uber drivers who are delivering food to us, are often people that are low paid jobs in precarious, workplace situations, and also, invisible to many people as well. I want to come to a question that Mohammed raises, which is very interesting. It's around, that idea that you raised around community and engaging with neighbours. And he says, is it the case that it's not very common in Australia to promote that neighbourly interactions? And I want to ask you that, Jan, in the context, hopefully you can draw on your Lebanese ancestry too, as a kind of cross-cultural analysis here. Does that play out differently, do you think?
I think in terms of sort of like Australian society in general, this is a very kind of general broad brush strokes, particularly if you're living, I think, in cities. I would acknowledge that it might be different in regional or smaller rural towns, but certainly in cities and even in suburbs within big cities, you don't really know your neighbours. You don't really interact with your neighbours. You might see your neighbours, you might say hi to your neighbours, but for the most part, everyone lives a kind of a very sort of private life. Like, your neighbours aren't just going to pop around and have a cup of coffee like they would in the villages of Lebanon. It doesn't, and there's many reasons why that's no longer the case. Like, we've got mobile phones for starters, which we didn't have 20, 30, 40 years ago. So now you can ping someone a text and let them know that you're coming and not pop by. There's also, I feel like sometimes because we're so busy, because our lives are so structured, you wake up, go to the gym, have a meeting, come back, cook dinner, do the kids, get them to bed, homework, all that. It almost feels like an imposition to connect with the street, with that, to make the street your community, because you've got so much going on that a neighbor knocking on your door just wanting to have a yarn is like, oh God, I don't really have time for this. I'm doing so many other things. But now that we're not doing as many of the other things as we have been, there seems to be this space opening up. And because we are actually physically quite restricted in where it is that we can move and who it is that we can see, again, it's opened up that idea of connecting to the people that are physically, geographically the closest to you. So I hope that that's, talking a little bit earlier about how it might change the way we interact with people once we sort of go back to, normal life. I hope that's something that we take away from this, is the importance of the idea of the community starting in your street. The idea of the community starting outwards from you to the person next to you, to the person in this apartment block, maybe to the person across the road, because when we haven't really been geared for that in the last few decades of Australian life, really.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and of course Hugh McKay has had a lot to say on this, is that while we are disconnecting increasingly from the people in our street because of a range of complex factors, that is resulting in a rise of loneliness. Perhaps there's some correlations between that and a rise in, mental health issues that are emerging as well. Can you speak a little about that? We heard this morning Scott Morrison, Prime Minister, obviously make some announcements around some funding for mental health and the and growing number of people that are taking to telehealth during these times. But yeah, if you could talk about that connection of the street and kind of mental health and loneliness and other things that are happening in parallel.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny you brought up Hugh McKay, because that's exactly who I was thinking of because I've only recently actually had a chat to Hugh specifically about all of this kind of stuff. So all of it sort of percolating in my mind. And it was partly because of something that Hugh said that I decided to, actually send out the little chocolate bars to my neighbours. So he was the kind of impetus for this. For those that are not familiar, Hugh McKay is sort of he's a really well-known social researcher and does great work in the area of sort of connection and loneliness. On the topic of mental health, this is, again, I think this is something that we're probably going to see the full effects of this particular time on people's mental health. I don't think are going to be fully realised for a while. I think the one thing that we've got to keep in mind, Helen, is that you've got situations where there are some people's businesses that have been completely decimated, or they've come to a complete standstill and they're not quite sure how they're going to rebuild. In many cases, that might be the only income for a family. So what do you do now? You've got situations where you've got, domestic violence in the home. You've got family violence in the home, and suddenly the home is the only place that you can be. So if you're in that kind of a position, well, what sort of time are you going to be having in this particular era, and how are you to seek help if you can't actually leave your home? We've got situations where we've got parents who are they're working from home, but not only are they working from home, but they now have their children at home, and they have to teach their children and become teachers for their children while still doing their full-time job. So we've got a lot of different pressures on people. We've got older people who maybe live by themselves, who are now deemed vulnerable people that need to self-isolate. They don't see anyone in days, if not weeks. Yeah. So I think we've got to think long and hard about the way in which this kind of pandemic can really affect the lives of people, and the way it can really affect the kind of the mental health of people. And I think the more, one, we talk about this, but talking about it cannot be enough. Talking about it is just a way of understanding that it exists. Two, there needs to be the right funding going to the right services so that they're able then to help the people who really need it the most. Because it's very easy to say things like, well, as long as you exercise and as long as you eat right and as long as you do all of this stuff, you'll be okay. Not everyone is in a position to be able to do that. I mean, you try telling a parent who has to work from home, set up all their stuff from home, and have their kids around all day, that they need to cook a nice home cooked meal and just go for a run. It's not easy for everybody to be able to do that. And so I think mental health is it's going to be a really, really big question once, for lack of a better phrase, the dust has settled from all of this. And that's why it's really important to reach out to people. It is really, really important to reach out to people. I've definitely become, I've always been close to my family. They're the best. I love them. But definitely reaching out more, definitely calling my grandmother more, definitely. And definitely just checking in. It doesn't have to be much. It can just be, hey, how you doing? Just checking in to see how you're going. Let me know if you need anything, even though there's probably not that much that I can do. It's just that solidarity, of like, we're all in the same boat. Yeah.
Absolutely. And speaking of checking in, Jen, I should take this moment to just say to the people that are on online at the moment, if this is raising any concerns for you, you can reach out to Lifeline. The number is 13 11 14. And if you work at Western Sydney University and need some support, we of course have an EAP system for complimentary counselling service. So you can reach out, just do a Google search. Jen, I want to address a question by Ali around Western Sydney and where did that question just go? Oh,
yeah.
In where the young
Do you think
people have been, where the young people are being targeted by police enforcing lockdown. What do you think of that?
You know, that's a really interesting question. The enforcements around the kind of the lockdown laws. There was a really interesting, I don't know if anyone here listens to a podcast called 7 a.m. I'm probably not supposed to be promoting it because I do a writing podcast called The Briefing. But, however, they did a really, really interesting story, or they did a really kind of interesting exploration on this question exactly, on who was bearing the brunt of the fines around the pandemic. And they worked out that actually there were hotspots in and around Western Sydney in particular. So I think it was Fairfield, Bankstown, and there was one more, it may have been Campbelltown, don't quote me on that, but it may have been, where there were more fines handed out to people in those areas than areas, outside of those spaces, which I think is particularly galling, given that some of the highest cases we've seen have been in Bondi, and some of the kind of worst flouting of the lockout laws have been in the eastern suburbs. So for the fines to occur predominantly in the western suburbs, when, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, but as far as I know, there's no evidence necessarily that there are more people misbehaving in the western suburbs compared to anywhere else in the country, or in the state. I think that raises a lot of questions. And I think the other point was, and again, this is just the part of the interesting podcast that I listened to, so credit to 7 a.m. here. They looked at some of the fines that were happening in regional towns and found that a significant number of the recipients were Indigenous Australians, So a number of the other states are yet to kind of release the data around who they're fining, why, for what reason and where. So I think it definitely stays, which should be a bit more transparency on that.
And we're just,
I think
your audio is just kind of trying to find itself there. So while I give you a second just to do that, I might just reference some stats from that study that the 7 a.m. study that you were talking about. I've got them right here in front of me. So as of the 22nd of April, that study showed that 15% of the fines issued in New South Wales pertaining to the lockdown were given in the Fairfield, Bankstown, Canterbury and Liverpool region, when at the same time, only 5% of the COVID-19 cases, were happening at those sites. Comparatively, in the Northern Beaches, only 1.8% of New South Wales fines were applied to that region, when that space had accounted for 15% of New South Wales COVID-19 cases. So that's interesting. And can we talk about that in relation to your book, which is coming out next year, of Middle Eastern appearance? Does that, perhaps this might be a very simplistic reading of that study there, but does that tell us something around the kind of criminalising or the policing of certain people and communities across our state?
Oh man, yeah. The police love nabbing boys from Bankstown. They really do. And this kind of comes from this comes from my personal experience. And there's also numbers around this stuff as well. We're certainly growing up in, the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. There was a lot of you know, a lot of kind of rhetoric around ethnic crime, ethnic gangs. There was a lot of policing of Middle Eastern boys. I remember this particular occasion where I was in a car, you know, with a mate of mine who was a Lebanese guy. And look, God bless him, he had a souped up car, because of course he did. And we're sort of just, you know, driving around, and this would have been in the early 2000s. And I remember I kind of like heard police sirens in the background as we were driving. And he said, "Oh, I bet I'm going to get pulled over." And my first reaction to that was like, you're not going to get pulled over. That's ridiculous. Like, just because you heard a police siren, now you think like they're coming for you. That's, you know, I think you're overstating that. And we got pulled over. We got pulled over. And there was a part of me that just thought to myself in that moment, I was like, why didn't I just believe him when he said that he thought we were going to get pulled over? Like, he knows, because he's had that experience of being a prime target for police. He's a young Lebanese looking man driving a souped up car. You know, that's catnip, I think, for kind of for law enforcement. And any kind of like young, you know, people who are seen as like hoons, or, you know, whatever you want to call them, that's always been the case. And I think it was like particularly prolific in the late 90s, early 2000s, in and around those areas. Yeah, I think over policing and the relationship between particularly young men in those areas and the police, I think that's a very, very fraught relationship. And I remember, again, growing up, there would be a lot of kind of affiliation with US rappers, you know, with kind of this rap culture in the United States that was very anti-police, you know, F the police and whatever. But there was some kind of like affinity that I think a lot of boys growing up in Bankstown, particularly, that was where I grew up, and that was, you know, who I associated with. I think they sort of felt a little bit of an affinity with that sentiment, because they felt perhaps that they were, you know, kind of targeted, not just by the police, but also just by the press, you know, as being these sort of very unseemly, very masculine kind of characters. When many of them weren't. I mean, maybe some were, but also some weren't, you know, so there was not that degree of complexity, I think, afforded to the community.
Yeah, so in the Frant, you talk about this in more detail, and you kind of allude to the fact that a lot of racial ethnic groups have had their go, you know, the kind of 90s Pauline Hanson, and then, you know, the Cronulla riots and other things, and then the Sudanese, you know, gangs most recently. What we've seen now, which comes to a question that Andrew Fong has submitted, is around, you know, the discrimination and racist behaviour that's actually emerged through the whole COVID-19 case, in relation, of course, to you know, Chinese or Asian communities more broadly. Can you talk a little about that and what that does to the notion of multiculturalism and the way that we experience?
Yeah. You know, Andrew, thanks so much for that question, because I think it's a really important question, and one that I have like a very low simmering rage about. I would love to say I'm surprised that we're seeing more attacks against Asian Australians and more kind of, you know, abuse being hurled at Asian Australians. I'm not hugely surprised. I'm disgusted and I'm disappointed, but in many ways, I'm not hugely surprised. We heard Alan Tudge, who I believe is the Minister for Multiculturalism, kind of come out and say, you know, racism is never acceptable in Australian society. And I would say that when Fraser Anning walked into the Senate and gave his speech where he used the term final solution, 20 senators congratulated that man. And when Pauline Hanson put forward a motion in the Australian Senate saying it's okay to be white, which is a well-known far-right provocation, I believe used by extremely odious right-wing groups at times. When she put that motion forward in the Senate, 28 senators voted for it. Peter Dutton can get on the television and say that it was a mistake to bring Lebanese people to Australia and is not reprimanded in any way. So this kind of underlying simmering racism, it manifests in very, very ugly ways in times of crisis. And we can look at a house that's been graffitied, and at the house of an Asian Australian family that's been graffitied with something disgusting, and say, oh, that's racism and that's not acceptable. But actually racism comes in many, many ways. And if you allow for it to fester, yeah, if you support it in ways that, as it seems innocuous as just a handshake in a Senate, that sends a huge message to people. So if you're not going to tolerate racism, don't tolerate it at all. Do not shake the hand of a far-right senator who uses the term final solution in the Senate. Do not do that if you're someone who doesn't want to tolerate racism. And I just, I think it's just so awful that Asian Australians, and I'm talking, Asians of all backgrounds, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese Australians, cannot walk down the street. I spoke to a woman the other day, just recently, actually for my podcast, who was walking down the street in Marrickville. She's Vietnamese. Her background is Vietnamese. She's born in Australia. She's walking down a suburban Australian street and gets called, I'm not even going to repeat the names here because I just can't. And gets into a situation where she thinks the person that is abusing her, she thought that they had a knife at one point because she was told that, I have a knife, don't come near me. And imagine just going about your day in this country, walking down a suburban street in Sydney, being a Vietnamese Australian, never been to China, was born in this country, and yet feeling unsafe because of the way you look, nothing other than the way you look. I mean, I don't know how we're not more outraged about this as a society, except that I do know, because we've been fanning that sentiment in very, very subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways for a very, very long time. I mean, again, sorry, you can tell I'm like, I'm a bit mad, But Pauline Hanson 20 years ago walked into the Senate and said Australia is in danger of being swamped by Asians, and that lady has been legitimised for 20 years. That sentiment has been legitimised for 2 decades. Every time she appears on the Today Show, every time she appears on Channel 7, every time she's on Dancing with the Stars, every time there's a story about her, you are legitimising that kind of sentiment. And unfortunately, the repercussions of which really manifest in times like this. And it sucks that Australians have to bear the brunt of it.
Yeah, and I think we have, in 20 years, very little has changed because we've got world leaders today coming out and calling COVID-19, the Chinese virus. I want to kind of connect some of the threads here because, as I've been kind of snooping around on TikTok, one of the things that I have a good chuckle about is the cultural jamming that's happening where people are making fun of that interview that Donald Trump gave where he refers to it as the Chinese virus. So young people are dressing up and mimicking him and using humor as a way to disarm him and, to provide some kind of very subtle and playful political commentary that suggests that that's just not right. So let's talk about humor. Jen, obviously, you're hilarious, you're funny, you're known for that. Yet at the same time, you're also known through your podcasts and your shows to combat and tackle some pretty heavy issues like gender, like racism. What's the role of humor in that? Is that a way to, get the average Australian kind of on board and not frightened? Or, yeah, tell me a bit.
I think humor is the best way to talk about things like that. I know there are some people who, think that there are certain things that are beyond the realm of jokes, or you shouldn't joke about certain things. I think you should joke about anything. I think you can joke about everything, but I think if you're going to joke about something serious, if you're going to joke about something that is heavy, then you better bring the joke. You know what I mean? Like, we're not playing now. Like, your joke better be funny, it better be good, it better be timely, it better be cutting, and it better say something decent, But I think no one's having a bad time when they're laughing. If you're laughing, you're having a good time. So you kind of, the ideal state, if you can get someone in a state where they're laughing and where they're having a good time, then they're going to be so much more malleable to actually listening to what else is being said. If people feel like they're being attacked or they're being shamed, or if people feel like they're being preached to, or if they're probably not going to respond. Like, think about your daily life. Like, if you were in a conversation with someone, you felt like they were preaching to you, it's immediately a blockage of like, well, I don't engage with this person. Why would I want to be preached to, you know? So humor is a really, really interesting and really valuable ways of being able to, you know, open that space and open that door and ease the entry, sort of. This metaphor is really quite terrible, but it basically, you know, it allows people to feel good. And I think when you're feeling good, you're a lot more open. And, you know, it's fun. It's really fun. It's fun, you know, to talk about hard topics in a fun way. And look, I grant you, sometimes if you're walking that line of trying to talk about a hard topic in a fun way, sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong. That's the truth, because it's a tightrope sometimes, because there are things that, you know, need to be given their due credence and, you know, their due respect, and might not work as a kind of a comedic takeaway. But when they do, it's great.
Yeah, well, speaking of kind of heavy topics, Pauline raises a really important point, and I think one that's kind of been missing from this whole COVID-19 narrative is really about the people with disabilities and how COVID-19 and social isolation is affecting them at the moment. You know, is there anything that, you know, that you can add to that, Jan? I, you know, just think about my community and my neighbourhood, the fact that the visibility of people walking around, you know, which has been something that's been quite heartwarming for me, seeing families walking and doing some exercise, which is great. But of course, in my neighbourhood, we don't have the infrastructure to enable people with mobility, diversity to actually get out and to participate in public life as much as they should be able to. Not sure if you have any comments on that.
On the kind of the mobility of people, for people to sort of be able to...
Yeah, well, just more broadly around people with disabilities and 19 and the relationship between the two. That's been a kind of silence narrative, I think, throughout this whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm conscious not to sort of speak on behalf of people with disabilities, because I think that they do such a great job themselves. And I think even before COVID-19 hit, and look, this is from my perspective, from someone who's sort of like an avid internet user, extremely online, apparently referred to as, but I think what the internet has allowed, and particularly what social media has allowed, and what having your own platform has allowed, it's allowed people a voice that I don't think would have otherwise been heard, really. And it's allowed, I think, in particular, minority groups, not just cultural minorities, but also, you know, disability groups, for example, who would have otherwise not really had a platform, not just to speak, but to create their own narrative, to really own the narrative of what it's like to be disabled in Australia, and to share that narrative, particularly from their perspective. I think it's twofold. One, we've moved online, so the kind of the ability to access people in many ways has become quite easier. But I think as well, you know, if you're disabled, and I do want to acknowledge that, you know, being someone with a disability, they're not a homogenous entity, you know, there are different disabilities that manifest in different ways. But I think, again, our focus should always be on people who are perhaps in situations where they're vulnerable, or who perhaps do not have as much agency as other people in society. And we kind of need to work out ways to put them at the forefront. Yeah, I hope that answers the question a bit.
Yeah, I think so. I guess one of the things that I was thinking about today as I was getting ready for this webinar is I put on lipstick, which is something I haven't done for about 5-6 weeks, and I always kind of forgot how to do it. And when I talk to my friends and sisters and colleagues about this, a lot of us have kind of positively relinquished, the gendered pressures that kind of pertain to beauty ideals. So we're all embracing the greys and the unplucked eyebrows and wearing flats or, comfy clothes at home. What's this say about, the sexism in public space? Do you think it provides some kind of commentary?
Yeah, I think it just goes to show just how much we can do without shaving our legs. And that, you know what? The sky's still going to be there if you got hairy legs. You know what I mean? You're right. I haven't put on a pair of shoes in a very long time. I did put some winged eyeliner on today for this esteemed webinar. But, as I was doing it, actually, I was like, oh, I haven't done this in a while. It's almost like quite nice to do it once every 2 months, right? But again, I think what this has shown is the consistent, the insistent sort of pressure that women are under, I think, to look a certain way, to present in a certain way, to behave in a certain way. That's all gone now. And we're realizing, oh, actually, I like not shaving my legs and not wearing a bra for 2 months, which I think is a common experience of all women, even if they won't tell you in public, so we're allowed to embrace our private selves a little bit more because we're obviously spending much more time in the private realm. And I think it's different for women and men in that women present a certain way in public where they might not present to that extent in private. And the private way is just much more comfortable. Why don't we make that the public presentation? That'd be great. We'd all be walking around with hairy legs then and no one would have a problem with it.
Yeah, well, speaking of gendered pressures, we've got the polling results, which are on your screen right now. It's interesting that, the biggest, the largest response we had to the question, what is the biggest challenge of social isolation, has been managing work and home responsibilities. So that's interesting. And then we've got the big percentage of social isolation has been, with 38% of people saying spending more time with family and friends. What do you think?
Yeah, I just want to also acknowledge the 5% who said that the biggest challenge of social isolation is dealing with Zoom. So I see you. We're all in the same boat. Solidarity.
I like the fact that only 0% of people have said that not seeing my boss has been the biggest advantage. That's curious.
Well, there you go. You must like your bosses then, in that case. I'm not hugely surprised. I think the worrying about the future is the big one, just because there's just so much uncertainty. It might be fine, it might not be fine. We're not too sure exactly how, what sort of shape this society will take once, the dust has settled and we can really kind of go back to normal. And I think, worrying about the future is something that all humans do. I think that's almost how we're wired, to just constantly be thinking about the future and all of the what if situations. I mean, that's classic anxiety. Anyone who's had anxiety will tell you that that's what it is to have anxiety. It's a snowballing effect of future scenarios that are taken to sort of their worst case. And this seems to be this sort of, this common anxiety that we're all sort of experiencing, and for good reason, frankly. I think it helps sometimes. Look, I'm a journalist, so yes, I'm going to stick up for my profession. But I think sometimes it does help to switch off for a bit. I think it does, and I think it's important to be able to manage the information that's coming in and the rate at which it's coming in, because it will not stop. It does not slow. So you need to put the brakes on that for yourself, because it won't do it on its own.
Yep. Okay, Jen, well, I'm mindful that, we've got 1 minute left, so I'm going to put it to you in 30 seconds or less, just to address a question we had, which is around the role of arts in redressing what we're going through right now. So 30 seconds or less, tell us about that, Jen.
Oh, the role of arts. I think arts is so crucial. I think it's why we do what we do, so that we can engage in arts. I'd say it's the cherry on top of the cake, but I think it's ultimately the cake. And it's really important for the arts to be successful, because I think the arts is the vehicle that tells us who we are. That's what the arts are. You know, their books, their plays, their music, their ways of understanding the world. And like we were talking about before, Helen, people are consuming so much information because we need to be able to understand the world that we live in. It's so uncertain that we need to be able to work out exactly what is going on around us. And, you know, there is a role for journalism to do that, but it cannot, you know, come anywhere near the role that the arts has in that particular space. And that's why it's so important.
Great answer. Thanks, Jen. And we'll actually be featuring a special Catalyst West conversation episode just on the role of arts and culture in the coming weeks. So if you want to be involved in that in whatever capacity, whether as a panelist or to suggest someone else, please online at catwest@westernsydney.edu.au. Thank you so much to everyone that was online today and for all your questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them today. Thank you so much, Jen. It was
pleasure. Thank you so much to everyone who asked questions, because I really wish that we could just, you know, just go to a pub. Helen will shout everyone drinks, no problem. Yeah. Western Sydney is going to take care of that, and we could just discuss this for ages, because there really is so much to talk about. So thank you to everybody who was out there listening, and thank you to everyone who sent questions in, and I hope that you enjoyed the chat.
Fantastic. Thanks again, everyone. Next week, Dr. Andy Marks is back for Catalyst West Conversations. You'll receive some comms about that soon. Until next time, take care and see you all.